Here we are, another live weekly update to talk about the week. And I have a couple notes. I have a page to go over. I also have been deep in a reflective state. Go figure. So my own musings about this past week have really centered on work projects, philosophical projects, personal projects, and some other like ways to weave in stories, things that have been prominent for me and then like true for me. And I guess I'm like kind of negotiating the interplay between what's true, what's a story, what's philosophically significant, what is personally relevant, what is politically salient, and then how all of that kind of weaves together to become material or content worth sharing. So, this is my like security hoodie to give myself a little bit of comfort. Because actually, the truth is that all of these themes for me have been coming up in the past week, especially with a decent amount of vulnerability. Now, I guess maybe we'll just start there. This isn't what I intended to do, but let's start there because some highlights around vulnerability from the past week. Well, to be fair, past couple of weeks, people have brought up questions of vulnerability to me a lot lately. Maybe it's just the nature of the work that I do and the way that I show up publicly with people, but everything from people saying vulnerability is my superpower to just straight up asking me like, and is that vulnerable? Does that feel vulnerable for you? Um, People are usually asking if it feels vulnerable for me to be like on a public stage and sharing stories, or I think creating spaces for community together, like for the love of strangers, which is my experiment this year that is wrapping up in just a couple of days. The big finale is on Friday, so 2 more days. And in those cases, what I'm doing is I'm sharing spaces, I'm creating spaces, I'm sharing stories. And these are personal, true stories, typically for me, even if it's not something that happened, it's something that I'm really thinking and feeling. And I'm putting it out there. And so for a while now, I would say like my default answer to the question of like, does that feel vulnerable has often been kind of a little bit like on this line of sometimes I think like it doesn't feel vulnerable for me to share what's true. Because I think that generally when people are asking that question, it's like they feel uncomfortable with like people knowing them or something. I don't know, that there's something about being seen or being known that feels vulnerable. That to me is less vulnerable. But I have been able to name and identify that where vulnerability actually comes up is more around if I need to depend on people for like the success of my work or the continuation of like earning a livelihood, that feels vulnerable because it changes the power dynamic, right? Like people could be like, "Oh, I hate this. I don't like it," and or do worse with it, and then now I'm vulnerable to people's reactions or their perceptions, causing hardship or challenge unduly for me, or more so. That feels vulnerable. Like if you depend on people and then they maybe don't show up for you. Yeah, I feel that. So, like for instance, in my work, yeah, I feel vulnerable when I'm leaning into, as I said a week or two ago, like that the trying to think about how to actually build out a sustainable business is like harder for me because that means I actually do need to depend on people. Also, the other vulnerability that comes from this, which is something I am more closely aware of and familiar with for sure over the years, is that in putting yourself out there, you make yourself vulnerable to people responding in ways that maybe are unwanted, if not unkind or even threatening or dangerous. So, some things could be like if we have a fragile sense of self or ego, like we might be vulnerable to people's nasty comments or mean spirited little jabs online, whatever else. But we also become very vulnerable to people being inappropriate or using some kind of attitude to like assume they have access to you or pursue you in more malicious ways. So vulnerability is interesting because I mean that I guess yes I would answer it does feel vulnerable. But the mere fact of like saying what's true for myself doesn't often feel vulnerable so much at all. Like I'm I would say that I'm not a person who struggles with the idea of being seen or known. Some people flat out like are scared of being seen and scared of being known by others. Um, I think deep down, even if you feel that way, most of us want to be seen and known by others. And I mean, most of my work is about like how we actually connect meaningfully and intimately with one another, which is kind of like built on a foundation of seeing and understanding each other. So that doesn't itself, the sheer act of being seen, definitely doesn't make me feel uncomfortable. It's more the risk of it not going well or being used in ways that are uncomfortable or maybe undesirable for other kind of motives. So it's interesting. I guess I'm going off on this riff kind of spontaneously because I ended up watching the conversation that happened with this was just some of my media intake. I ended up watching the conversation that was recently published on the podcast Diary of a CEO. I don't particularly love the idea of CEOs, so I don't particularly love the concept of the podcast. Um, but it was Brené Brown's interview, and that has come up in conversation with someone in town recently, especially in the liberation of local spaces, and it is kind of actually pertinent to what I will talk about later on this live update around my work and working relationships. But Brené Brown is giving insight into, her research and work, which is often focusing on like senior executive leaders of Fortune 100 companies, so CEOs, and also she referenced like professional sports teams and the military and who she's working with. So you can have some qualms around that if you want. But her research in general is often known for being focused on vulnerability and shame and courage and leadership and kind of being wholehearted and knowing our feelings and then being able to like engage in that way with each other. So she says, she's not a therapist, but she works with a lot of people in this kind of like with a background in social work and research on, I would say, social emotional kind of mechanisms of human behavior and experience. So I did appreciate that when she talked about vulnerability and she said, vulnerability is actually when we have exposure, risk, or uncertainty, that we feel vulnerable when those three things are like present for us. So I guess that kind of makes more sense in terms of where the question of what is vulnerable or what makes oneself feel vulnerable if there's risk, exposure, or uncertainty of how things are going to go. What I also kind of appreciated was that she gave a context for how courage is not possible without a sense of vulnerability. So, she just gives a story that, like, where she's talking to people and saying, like, think of a time when you had to be courageous or brave, and did it not have risk, exposure, or vulnerability or uncertainty? And the answer is usually no. So she just draws the conclusion to say, like, if we're going to have courage, if you're going to live bravely, then you have to be vulnerable. And so there's this like whole thread of vulnerability and why it's so important to be vulnerable on a grand scale of things, of like doing important work in the world, clearly leading, since that's one of her like main channels of engagement, but also in terms of personal relationships, intimate connections, like how we actually are with one another when people are afraid of being vulnerable or are unwilling to risk exposure, or they don't know how things are going to go if they actually like present themselves honestly and openly to another person. The uncertainty of how that might pan out is enough to shut people down and then literally foreclose the opportunity for something really beautiful or great to happen. So anyway, that's one thing that I've been thinking about because vulnerability has come up so much. So in conversation with people, just serendipitously, that podcast showed up for me. Maybe. I don't know how my life works. But it has been a feature in conversations in Liberation is Local. Someone has been coming up and referenced the Brené Brown interview. So I think that kind of like had it in my head. And maybe that's why I decided to just like watch the whole 2-hour thing. Another thing about vulnerability, there's 2 more parts I want to make. Like today, this was truly serendipitous, like the way of the world. This is just a true story now I'm going to tell you. Last night, I had this thought about Marina Abramovic, who, if you don't know, is like a very, very, very world famous performance artist. And I guess she calls herself the grandmother of performance art, which feels fitting to me. But her work is notably something that unnerves people because it is in the performance art so exposing. Like in the 70s, she did a lot of pieces that were like naked and in front of people, in front of the public, and the public had like open free reign to do whatever they wanted to her, which is like talk about risk and uncertainty and exposure, like all three. So anyway, Marina Abramovic actually is a pretty strong influence in me inadvertently, because in 2010, when she did The Artist is Present at the MoMA in New York City, I actually had the opportunity to go and then see many of her other pieces in the exhibition too, as well as her sitting there. So I don't often name it. I might change my website and put her as like a kindred creative spirit kind of person, because it's true. But I think about her a lot in terms of performance art, and she might be one of the biggest performance artists like that I know of. The other person I reference is Miranda July, who is much more like queer and weird and contemporary, and like generationally closer to me. So anyway, I'm listening this morning now to an interview with Marina Abramovic about her work. And first of all, I hated that interview. The interviewer, I don't even know his name, but he was terrible. Absolutely an ass. And he interrupted her all the time. She held her composure and kept being like, can I talk about this? Or I don't want to talk about this. Like, or what a terrible question. Like, this is not interesting. So she handled herself, I think, pretty well. I would have been so frustrated in that dynamic, which I think is only interesting for me to note, because I'm like, I've had a couple of experiences lately, and I'll just put this one in that, like, the camp of Marina Abramovic is like a fucking badass. And this person interviewing her clearly had his own tells of revealing his own discomfort around performance art, where he was like, it kind of doesn't make sense. It's a little confusing, or maybe people don't think it's very relevant. And she was like, you seem uncomfortable with this, which I think was a great call out. Anyway, his interview sucked because he could not like stay with her and actually get to an interesting place. I think the interview with Brené Brown that I'm referencing now also was a pretty decent interview, in the sense that they actually went places that felt much more exposing and far more vulnerable. But the third thing, now I'm going to just putting these people together. The third part that I'm going to share from my life that wasn't this week, but relatively recently, was that I went to a show of Maria Bamford. Now, if you don't know Maria Bamford, I do list on my website as one of my like creative kindred spirits from the comedy realm. And what she does, I love her work because it is notoriously also very meta in some of her projects that she's done, whether that's stand-up specials, or particularly what I love is the series that came out like 2016-ish or so, called Lady Dynamite. And that is where she is playing a character who is a stand-up comedian who has a mental breakdown and then is trying to rebuild her career and have a comeback after, like, you know, getting things back situated in order. But it's highly meta, seemingly autobiographical. And I loved it, and like zany and weird. So anyway, Maria Bamford, by the way, is the first comedian that I remember seeing on television as a child. And she did all these voices, so it captivated me, and there were lots of things that I liked about her. So Maria Bamford, I think, is like kind of my root comedy uh, influence, maybe. I've always liked comedy, but Maria Bamford's the first person I know. Miranda July, I could tell a history about her too. Marina Abramovic now, another person. I have a lot of these little figures that are really, really fascinating. But the things that I'm noting is that I'm probably least attached to Brené Brown, actually. But Marina Abramovic had this interview with this person who could not handle talking about performance art. And it was so egregious and so offensive. And also, like, what are you doing? But he clearly didn't understand her. And I think that that's just important, because what she's doing, she's trying to convey to someone who, like, is not in the world of understanding performance art, let alone her. And she was trying to convey, like, what it's actually about, that this isn't about just, like, making noises. This is about music, or this is about, like, something so deep. Like, if you can really convey something so deep that it becomes human, really, more than it is personal. And I love that. But I'm just thinking, like, for someone to bring on Marina Abramovic and then not understand how to engage with her, what, like, an insult. But also, maybe he's just not gonna get it. Fair. I'm connecting that to Maria Bamford and her show because this is the second time I've seen her perform live. And she is, as she said, even in her own set, an acquired taste and not for everybody and not really a fun time. Um, but towards the end of her set, I would say, with like 20 minutes or so left, like people started getting up and walking out and like leaving. People who paid money for tickets to go to this comedy show at a pretty large venue, were leaving Maria Bamford's show now. So maybe, I don't know what's going on in people's lives. Who knows? But I would assume that some of them just did not really enjoy it. And I think that as much as I loved seeing Maria Bamford live, um, I respect her as an artist, and I also didn't love everything that she said too, which is totally fine. Um, I think we have so much expectation for artists in general to, like, speak to us in a certain kind of way that matters to us, that if we don't have the kind of experience we wanted, that now we're putting that on them, that it wasn't very good art. I think there's so much to unpack there. And in fact, actually, I've been doing a lot of review and archive kind of work, if you will, if you call like my camera roll on my phone an archive. But I found a clip of one of Maria's specials that I just like recorded the TV of her opening up. And she did all these things where she's like, I know we're all here in LA and many of us are artists or creatives and you're coming to a show. And she does many voices. So she says something along the lines of like, now, if you find yourself being like, oh, well, I thought comedy was supposed to be funnier than that, or why isn't this giving me the exact experience I hoped for? Or, something like that. She's like, I invite you to let that rage trampoline you into working on your own stuff. So I just love, she's irreverent and kind of doesn't give a fuck. But anyway, bringing all this around, part of why I'm going here, I guess, is because one, I love the experience of being at Maria Bamford's show and agreeing with like, maybe what I'm assuming is that some people didn't like her style. And sure, fine. I didn't love every second of Maria Bamford's set either, but rarely is that the case with comedy or, a movie, whatever. And that doesn't mean it's not good, but it was really important and like powerful for me to watch strangers get up mid-set and walk out of Maria Bamford's set. Because she's like fucking Maria Bamford. And for people to leave in the middle of that is really just, I don't know. I think maybe you're getting what I'm getting at. Like, it was surprising to me, but also humanizing and really like humbling in a way, or reassuring maybe. I don't know the words I'm looking for. I need Brené Brown's like Alice of all the feelings of 87 human emotions. But there was something important for me, I noticed in myself, to be able to see that you can be a Maria Bamford and people will still walk out of your set. And that does not mean you're not Maria Bamford. You get it? All of this, again, I started here by talking about vulnerability and exposure and risk or uncertainty. And if people, like how people often, I think, respond in what I assume is the way of thinking, it's very vulnerable for us to put ourselves out there. Lately, especially, I've had a lot of people also saying like, wow, you're really putting yourself out there. And I guess, yes, that's true. I am, but I'm doing it for very particular reasons. And this will be, I don't know, the fourth or fifth thing I'm going to say about vulnerability. And I guess why I'm starting with this is that as I've been doing my own reviews over the past year of what I'm trying to get into for next year, the ideas that I have of the kind of work I want to be creating and the spaces I want to be creating to facilitate a certain kind of engagement with myself and with others who want to participate, it does feel very vulnerable. And I haven't explicitly described this, I don't think really anywhere, but I'm alluded to it, I think last week on the live, that I have actually for the past near almost exactly 2 years now been doing therapy specifically to try to work through the, like, we call them ropes because they're like woven together and then knotted together. So like major ropes in my own experience around work, creative and projects and philosophy, the kind of stuff I want to do, professional work. Oh, sorry, that's work here. Intimate partnership, romantic life and personal life, and then just like core wound trauma stuff that like we all have. We'll summarize that in the 4. And while we are working on professional, philosophical, personal, and then just kind of like the stuff of therapy, those ropes all weave together, and some threads that my therapist and I have been talking about or acknowledging is like vulnerability, safety, and like self-trust. Particularly for me, I know that this feels extra salient or edgy because I do so much work locally. That's one. So like these are real people with real relationships. I'm not just like doing work on the internet to strangers, which actually feels quite different because it's such a parasocial relationship on the internet. But to do deep community engaged work is like very personal. And I've been located in this community that I'm in now for pushing 2 decades. And so it feels like, when I said earlier, like what feels vulnerable is having to depend on people to be able to do what you need to do, that we have to actually be able to depend on each other. It becomes so interdependent. And that feeling, I think, is when people really brush up on a sense of vulnerability. So for me, I have noted vulnerability and also safety. And a lot of that has to do with simple things like people could ruin your life, they could ruin your reputation, or they could open up opportunities that just are so beautiful because they know you, or because they don't like you, you know. There are other options. I don't mean to be so binary, but like in that case, the consequences or the opportunities feel very, very close and can have a significant amount of impact. That's so different from playing an algorithm to try to get engagement in an attention economy from strangers over the internet in order to reap some kind of success. I think you can see the difference. So anyway, I'm talking about that in therapy, and I was just going to name it that for the past 2 years, I've been very intentional because I knew that there was something holding me back in the way that I wanted to do my work. I've said this for decades. It's annoying to me too. Like I'm exhausted by it. But for literally decades, I've been like, why can I not write the things I want to write or share the things that matter the most to me? Like, or really, really put myself out there in the way that is like the core of my truth, my stories, my experience, the stuff that I think about that I know is so important to me. That's what I really want to be sharing, but I have not done a very good job of doing that. And I think there are clearly reasons why from all of these ropes that connect and weave together and then kind of get locked into a knot. So that's what explicitly for the past 2 years I've been really addressing in therapy. Um and I made some decisions to make sure I can continue working with this therapist in the next year because I know that I'm at this place where like I've done a lot of really good work. I've changed and grown a lot. I am putting myself out there in new ways. I'm much more public, far more experimental, and really like present in as much as I can, a community space way with like real people in real time and not just on virtual or remote environments. And I want to keep doing that. As I was saying last week, I want to keep building in experimental ways and to echo the ways that I've been creating in experimental ways. And none of that is possible without people, without community, and without relationships. And just like last week when I was talking about fractals, kind of like to name a component of what do we mean by building, the whole energy of building that I was introducing. Well, the fractals are like the small things reflect the whole. So if there's a very large idea or system or transformation we're looking for, focusing on the small scale of transforming those things is significant and meaningful and strategically pretty effective. So that would be like if we want to build community where people are interdependent, supported, trusted, safe, and feel secure with others where we can like take care of one another, then even practicing that on a small scale of doing that with like our most close, intimate friends, partners, family, loved ones is a way to mirror the possibility for that on a larger scale. And we could even go even deeper. I think it's appropriate to say that the fractal can be so small that it even is what we do within ourselves individually. So having the space, the capacity, building the conditions for us to feel safe, secure, and trusting where we know we belong and can be ourselves and held in that with respect and care and love. That's a practice that we can do even on the mini, 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 mini microcosmic fractal of how we relate to ourselves. I did not anticipate to go here. Let me just say, this is just me spitballing for 20 minutes, sharing a lot of things, but this is truly where I'm at and, kind of what I'm thinking about right now. I think I will shift into talking about, a couple of things that I'm working on literally at this particular moment, which relates to the page that is in the it was Liberation Liz Locals page this past Sunday that I presented, but it's also in the chat of Want to Know, my Substack newsletter. So if you want it, you can find it. This is the page, just for the sake of having a visual. And I am talking about specifically up here, I said a note on working relationships, because currently right now, one of my projects that I'm working on is just something that I have to right now. I'm specifically focusing on this idea of working relationships. This is an old idea. It's something I brought up in 22. Actually, I created a Substack newsletter called Working Relationships that was going to explore these themes that I'm going to go a little deeper in. But I didn't go very far on the newsletter because that's just kind of how it goes for me. Sometimes I create something and then I just don't continue it. But I love that it exists and I love that it was a thing, and maybe it just wasn't its time yet. So now, 3 years later, I'm returning to working relationships. So much so that, check this out, I pulled out a little notebook to kind of write some notes for myself, and I found this. This is me, the archivist, always keeping documentation and records. But I just pulled out of a box that I have in a closet, which has journals if I need to grab a new one. So I pulled this one, grabbed it, and it says Some of Working Relationships from April of 22. And I was like, well, that's interesting since I'm working on it now. And I decided to look at it and write my newest ideas on working relationships as of December 7th, 2025. So towards the end of the notebook here, I have what I'm thinking now about working relationships to kind of pull it all together. Anyway, I guess the insight from that is that this is a long thread. It has existed for years. I've been talking about working relationships, and that makes sense as to why. One, I'm focusing on it right now as a current project. I'm working on developing pages, or we're calling it a resource, if you will, about working relationships. Specifically, this is an ask from someone in a leadership role, working in an organization, trying to do good culture, systemic, transformative change that really helps people. It's important. And she's coming across some, I think, pretty common and predictable challenges that most people who are in positions of trying to make transformation within existing systems encounter. It's because of power dynamics. It's because of the culture that we exist in. It's because of all of these things that when we're trying to do things differently within a space where that's not built for that, and with people who maybe obviously are bringing in all their own shit, and then you add power dynamics on top of that, of course, we can expect to have some things pop off and some obstacles and roadblocks in the way, and we have to know how to navigate that. But that is emotionally taxing, personally challenging, professionally exhausting, and very, very difficult. So working relationships is pulling off of my years of experience doing culture change work and being just sort of a people-oriented, relational kind of person. And working specifically with leaders and executive leaders, and my own kind of reflective processes, that was basically what I did when I had a official, regular, not self-employed job. So I'm taking the experience of many years of that and putting it into working relationships, hopefully to help people who are in those kind of leadership roles within organizations or within systems, because I know that we all need support. Now, the complexity, of course, is that when we're in those environments, organizations, systems, relationship dynamics professionally, we're also interfacing with people as whole people. And so the themes and the struggles and the patterns that come through are not limited to professional spaces. Working relationships then is expansive enough that it is also naming and elucidating the kinds of dynamics and characteristics that come through in all of our relationships, especially like personal relationships, interpersonal dynamics. And as someone who has dated a lot of people, I'm pulling from my long experience of romantic relationships as well, decades of seeing people, being seen, having intimate ways of knowing folks in many different kinds of relationship types or situations. Um, I just kind of have accepted the fact that this is my life after decades of dating. I have known a lot of people in pretty personal, intimate ways and have been known too, similarly. And so there's something about like what we mean when we say working relationships. Clearly, it's a play on words to do working relationships at work in a professional space, but also like what makes our relationships work so we can have healthy, sustainable working relationships with each other in all aspects of our lives. So a core component of my work, you're going to see, I'm just going to keep doing arm gestures so you can see the resonance of what I'm talking about here. But when I introduce working relationships, one of the key things about it is that I always say the personal is political, which is just like an old adage from like the 70s. Didn't we already accept all of that? The personal is political. Second wave feminists were saying that. People have known that for centuries, but it became popularized as a slogan decades ago. But the personal is political, and also the professional is political and philosophical. So I always work with these four quadrants: personal, political, professional, and philosophical. And I think they're all related. Like we can't just say, I'm just doing my job, and what is professional is like totally removed from personal or politics. Nope, not true. And everything that we do, I think, is philosophically grounded, whether or not we're conscious of it. When I would teach classes, one of the lenses that I would offer my students to think about anything, no matter what it was we were talking about, it could be an essay, it could be a concept, it could be like one phrase and statement. I would be like, well, what about that is politically or philosophically significant? That's not true. To be honest, I would say, isn't that philosophically and politically significant that this is the case? And so I think we could summarize that, be like, don't you think it's politically and philosophically significant that so many people feel isolated, disconnected, detached from others, or alienated and separated and compartmentalized from their professional work in order to survive and get along? Don't you think it's politically and philosophically significant that we don't have skills and capacities to navigate power dynamics that are set where people have power over each other in a rather like kind of toxic way? So much so that people need therapy because of the workplace that they're going to. And if you're fortunate enough to have an employee benefit where like your employer supports your access to therapy, excuse me, something is going on here. Um, yeah, great that we have the support, but like I knew people, myself included, who needed therapy because of workplace dynamics. If that doesn't tell you that there's something politically and philosophically significant and personally impactful about like the ways that we're engaging with work, then like, what do you mean? Likewise, the fact that we are trying to cope in a world where people need jobs but we're struggling to find jobs. So we'll take jobs that grind us and like our soul into ash is part of a larger, don't you think, philosophically and politically significant system that keeps people so exhausted, so tired, so desperate in a place of scarcity that we struggle to have even the time and capacity to meaningfully connect with other people in a personal way, therefore having the conditions to build community or something more sustainable and secure for us. All these things are interrelated. I'm not going to go on any further. That's kind of the gist. When I'm talking about anything, even including this little mini pseudo separate project of working relationships, the themes of personal, political, professional, and philosophical are always connected. That's just how I live my life. And I'm going to ruin it for you. It's not limited to just this pseudo separate project of working relationships. This is the nature of all of my work. This is the nature of how I move through life. If it wasn't indicated alone by the fact that for like almost 20 years now, I have referred to what I'm doing as my philosophy, then I don't know what other significant signal I could give you to say. I think our personal lives are also philosophically significant. The work that I've chosen to do and like lean into saying I'm a philosopher now is also professionally connected. And everything for me is related to politics. There's no way around it. That's why I speak about the issues that I do. So, ta, maybe we could say that's just so coherent and very integrated. And that can be a point of privilege. We could talk about that to be able to have everything be so integrated. Though I just think it's a matter of good faith to acknowledge that's true no matter who we are, no matter what our situation is. It doesn't mean that they're good politics or that like they're aligned in a way that feels sustainable or healthy. But I do think that we cannot separate our personal, professional, political, and philosophical aspects of our lives. They just might be in dissonance with one another. And when you feel that, we have problems at the small level, internally, interpersonally, between us and our relationships, within communities, and for sure on a systems level. Dissonance on those things creates tension, discord, and problems. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, where I'm going to go with this now is I want to show a little bit of the page that I was talking about at Liberation is Local, which is just one snippet out of working relationships. I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen with this resource of working relationships as I continue to develop it over the next few weeks. Um, I had someone say like maybe this could turn into a space where like people who are struggling within their roles or their organizations could get support because these things happen. Yeah, and we can like talk about it from a place of liberation or from a place of how to do it differently, how to be who we need, which is like my new phrasing, learn how to be who we need. Um, Maybe that'll happen. But I just, to be really candid, it was like, this has been hard for me. Creating this resource or focusing specifically on trying to pull stories, experiences, insights, lessons, things that I have learned, the patterns that I've observed over, we'll just say like a decade or so of doing work within organizations that focuses specifically on transformation, equity, culture change, how to do things differently, has been hard for me. So speaking of vulnerability, I don't know that it's so vulnerable for me to share right now that reviewing these things through the lens of like, I need to put all this together has been hard because it has surfaced many experiences that I've had of conflict or challenge or kind of butting heads with people in power, discord, all of the things. But it is vulnerable in the sense that like I've I've been revisiting these very difficult experiences that I've moved through. Like I sometimes I'm like, do people not realize that like if you're going to be someone who really raises critical questions or is committed to speaking the truth for the sake of pushing for like progressive, positive, radical change, especially if it's to truly change things on a fundamental level, there's no way that that is not going to create consequences that are hard. Like I have dealt with some pretty harsh consequences because of the work that I've done pushing for culture change that I truly, really deeply believe in. So it's not an easy road. Obviously, it's not. People get pushed out all the time. Like, when you're really trying to change systems, you become the target because the system wants to try to maintain itself. And the people who align with that to uphold the status quo are going to protect and defend themselves, which means you might be taking some hits. So anyway, it has been quite vulnerable for me to go through my own like memories of so many different experiences, conversations, interactions, encounters, and things that have happened in my career that show how difficult it is to really make transformative change within systems. Because people have to want to change. They have to want to know how to change, which is why I have the phrasing want to know. Like, but then beyond wanting to change or wanting to know what to do, there also is this really important part about having the capacity, the skills, and the conditions to be able to do that. I've been saying this a lot in my head, just because you heard it doesn't mean you learned it. Just because like you've been introduced to something and now you are familiar with an idea does not mean you'll be able to perform and embody it. That requires practice. That literally requires us to change. And so it's not that we can just get exposure to ideas and then think, oh, great, that's all we needed. Now things are going to be different. No, we have ideas, but anything that just stays in the realm of idea or theory and doesn't turn into practice is not going to itself elicit the kind of changes that we really need. Now, I'm pausing because I want to connect. Like, my brain wants to go to a place to talk about performance art again, since that's where I started. How much time do we have today? Let's hold that thought, because I just want to say thinking in transformative ways is my old like slogan from 2010. And I do think that thinking, critical reflection, can be a practice itself that helps move us and change us. So there's some nuance there of like, can we actually engage in the process of learning, of critically thinking, of being open to being changed? That process of development, which we might just call learning, in a truly like embodied, full learning, I'm incorporating what I'm hearing and internalizing that to now move differently. That's learning. That is a change process. So anyway, please, let's hope. Let's hope that learning is enough for us to change, know better, do better. Thank you, Maya Angelou. But what I'm trying to say is that just because we hear something or exposed to an idea does not necessarily mean it's going to change if we don't do anything with that to like actually incorporate it into our into our practices and ourselves, so that we ourselves become changed people too. And I do think that could be like a summary Cliff Note version of why so much doesn't work. So here's actually the page that I was talking about and introduced to folks at Liberation is Local. We are going to be focusing on working relationships for the next couple of weeks in Liberation is Local, so that I just can have less pulling me in different directions. I need to just focus on this. So again, I wrote multiple pages around working relationships. This is just the one that I presented on Sunday. So if you were looking for this, you can find it in the chat on Substack. But basically what I tried to show is that in working relationships, this little cutie here at the top is saying like, hey, have you ever wondered why the things that are supposed to work don't end up working well or at all for us? And that question, I think, is really important, because let's zoom out and think about the grand scheme of like social political transformation that so many of us desperately want right now. When we look at the whole landscape of the world on fire, we might be like, oh no, what can we do? Give us something that will work. And then people will say, well, there is a blueprint, by the way. We're not starting from scratch. We don't have to come up with like something out of literally nothing. There's history, there's lineage, there are cultural traditions, there are political movements. There have been long lines of people who have studied and understood and known and practiced and built revolutionary ways of resisting that have supported and sustained for centuries. So if we look to the blueprint, we could say there is a path already laid for us. We might adopt it, change it, accommodate for the times and the conditions that we're in, but that doesn't mean we're starting from scratch. However, most people are like dumbfounded, totally overwhelmed, have no idea what to do, because they won't even look at the blueprint. Now, the blueprint, by the way, I believe in it. This is what I talk about in terms of like what I have faith. It's because I truly, truly, truly believe in the truth of the values that I always try to get closer to myself. So I believe in the blueprint. I believe in the values. I would call those liberatory values. Many of the things that I talk about in Liberation is Local and then just kind of are present throughout other work. I'm not going to go through the litany of specific values now, because the point I'm trying to make is that even if we were given a glossary of definitions or a taxonomy of liberatory values, or even like infographics on social media that very visually in appealing ways present to us, this is what we need: mutual aid, we need to divest from certain systems, we need to build relationships, we need to learn some basic skills for how to survive. all these things to become more sustainable, self-sufficient, self-determining, and collective in our efforts, where we take care of each other and we support each other and we build new things. Even if we're given that information in the clearest possible way, which is what these little bubbles here are saying. How familiar are these voices? We need it to be actionable and practical. Just tell us what we're supposed to do, but can I get it in a bullet point checklist? Even if we were given those things as clear as possible, and let's take it for granted, assume they are true, tried and tested, and is the blueprint that we've inherited. Most of the time, people want to know what they need to do to achieve their desired outcomes of what works. Yes, so that's what we have actually available for us. Best practices, concrete examples, recommended actions, on and on and on. But they still won't end up working for us. That's the original cutie question. We might be given the things that are supposed to work, but they don't end up working for us. And have we ever wondered why? I don't think that it's because the information or the suggestions or the actions or the strategy or the blueprint is necessarily wrong at all. I'm the same. Let's just assume that's all true and good. But so much of the time it doesn't work. And this is this bubble over here. I was trying to do it in the bigger context or condition. You want what's working, but look at what's surrounding it. What's happening here is that we should also be willing to acknowledge what doesn't work and why, including the conditions in which we work and relate with one another. So in the conversation on Sunday, I really like this because I use the example of people when they want to know what they need to do to achieve their desired outcomes. Give me the best practices. Give me the actions. Give me the recommendation. Put it in a list. That may not work because that's basically the metaphor I used was looking for a recipe and then expecting it to be perfect and taste amazing regardless of your skill set of whether or not you've even cooked before. The recipe might be sound. That might be perfect and delicious, amazing. But you maybe are not the one to execute on that recipe. Now, in our conversation on Sunday, it even went a little bit further, and I love the way that the metaphor sort of developed because then I was like, wait a minute, this is actually also imagine that you are given a recipe with people who have never cooked before and you're situated in a garage. You're not even in a kitchen. You don't have the tools. You don't have the experience. You don't have the know-how to use those tools. And you lack the basic cooking skills. You're going to criticize the recipe in that situation or maybe wonder, why isn't this working? Because there's more context and more conditions and maybe even capacities that are lacking that are making the very, very sound recipe taste like trash. Okay? So when we are willing to acknowledge what doesn't work and why, I think this is maybe the crucial first step, or maybe it's the first step in the process of figuring out how we actually make change. Because people want to jump to tell us what to do and assume that if they're told what to do, that they can do that. And most of the time, they definitely don't, and they definitely can't. But for that process of acknowledging what doesn't work and why, looking at the conditions, the context, or maybe the capabilities that are present, I refer to that as looking in the mirror instead of looking for a recipe. Looking in the mirror can be tough, especially if people are not ready to be maybe uncomfortable with the truth that they might have to face about themselves and what's really happening. So I'm not even making this just a personal attack. Truly, I'm not. I do think people need to have the willingness to really critically reflect on themselves and be willing to see themselves differently if we actually want to make changes. That goes for everybody. I don't care who you are. We grew up and we are conditioned within cultures of colonization and white supremacy. People don't like it when I use those words, but really, no matter what, if you are not capable of looking at white supremacy and how it shows up with you, then you are likely going to be replicating those things. And that's an uncomfortable thing because people don't want to be affiliated with the perpetuation of white supremacy if they're a person who seeks to be anti-racist. But the truth of the matter is you have to be able to see what's really happening and how that's showing up if you're really going to change. So you have to look in the mirror. Look in the mirror and look at what's really, really happening. Those make people often uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't work. But the other part that I wanted to say about here, what I just shared is kind of I'm going to just go through what the cuties are saying. Sometimes they speak better than I can. This little cutie is thinking oh, so if we pay attention to what doesn't work or why, you mean it's not just being informed about what we can do, but also learning how to be who we need? And that's that learning developmental process of like becoming people who can do the stuff that is recommended. The other thing that's happening here is this little cutie down here, who I think is highly represented among the people. And they are saying, oh, yes, this recipe, if you will, sounds appetizing and delicious, but they're actually thinking palatable, at least. And I think that there's something important there where, like, we might say, oh, yeah, the recipe sounds good. We want that. This is what I've seen in leadership in organizations where they say, yeah. We want these changes. We want to be able to support people. We want to be able to provide resources. We want to be more equitable, all those things. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking, this sounds palatable, at least. As soon as you offer a path forward that does not sound palatable to them and their preferences or their tastes, it's not going to happen. So there's this like level of not just comfort, but judgment of evaluation, like that's based on whether or not people are really willing to look in the mirror for themselves. So again, this isn't just to like make it personal about people needing to look at themselves, but it's also what's really happening. And for that, what I actually am talking about is I put it on the page. Deeply impactful transformative change happens when you change the conditions that shape what we do. And you have to then change the culture. So what I was doing here is kind of on purpose. I referred to this very cliche phrasing that culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever. People say it all the time. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, meaning you can have a really tight strategy and it will never work if the culture doesn't afford the opportunity for the strategy to actually like land and get traction and be implemented appropriately. The culture, I think one of the best ways that I've heard people describe culture is like how things actually get done and what really happens. Like we could say, oh, no, we are a shared leadership space and everybody gets input. But like how it really happens, the actually how things get done reflects a culture where like someone makes the decision and feedback is just kind of like lip service or something along those lines. So culture may be something that is hidden. It's not what we want to say. It may not even be what we profess, but it's how things actually get done and what really happens. I think that the culture can be, again, reflected on an organizational level. If we're talking professional spaces, it can be talked about in terms of our personal relationships and our families, our lives. Like the culture of our relationships is significant. Like, for instance, we might say, oh, we have a very supportive relationship. The culture then would be one of support. But how things actually get done or what maintains that is that people just do not express their needs. So what's really happening is not so much that there's support, but that there's silence. And so there isn't even the opportunity for there to be support isn't given when needs are not named. But that might actually be what's happening below the surface in a kind of implicit kind of way. What I was doing here, again, intentionally, when I say deeply impactful transformative change happens when you change the conditions that shape what we do, I also made a connection on this page about culture being the conditions of our choices. And that was a deliberate phrasing because I wanted to make an explicit callback to the ways that I describe power as the ability to influence the conditions of our choices. So let it not be missed that we have power, all of us do, and we can use our power to influence the conditions of our choices, which is really about shaping culture. And then culture is what becomes the fertile soil for planting seeds of change and letting them actually grow. Okay, that's like an overview over here. But again, to summarize what I was trying to make a point about this page of working relationships is that, like, we could be told these are the things we need to do to make change. I'm going to transfer to like a personal kind of dimension here of romantic partnerships. If we're trying to build secure and safe relationships and we know how to communicate with each other, we're looking for like secure attachment bonds or something. People could follow all the language and use all the therapy speak and become very proficient in the vocabulary. But that doesn't necessarily at all mean that we are actually creating an environment or a culture within our relationships where that is safe and people do feel secure. So anyway, again, my point here with this page and what I'm trying to convey is that it's not enough to just think about what is supposed to work, even if that's tried and true and gold. we have to also be looking at what doesn't work and why, which is looking in the mirror, thinking about ourselves, what's really happening in the culture that we're in, which is taking into account conditions, context, and our capacities for actually implementing any kind of changes. All of this is to say, I don't know why am I talking about this. I didn't really want to talk about working relationships, but it's just what I'm doing. It's what I'm doing now. And again, it has been so front and center because I do think that in a way, if I can kind of just wrap my arms around working relationships as like a separate sort of project where I'm trying to develop resources around it or engaging in conversations with people specifically in this domain, then what feels like somewhat self-contained as a project we can name separately, like this is working relationships and here are my pages I've developed about it. It at least is a way to engage with folks that ultimately pulls a lot of these patterns that I think are relevant on political levels and also philosophical levels that can be sort of grounded often in a professional space, but it's not unusual for people who I'm like working in supportive sessions with or having conversations where they're like, oh, actually, this content, the information you've given us has really helped me in my personal life with my relationships or as like a parent or a partner. So yeah, great. I love that. That makes sense to me. And I'm glad that that's the case. How do I pitch it for people? Organizations at this point, I'm learning like, are not really willing to engage, me at least, as much around working relationships as they are like Brené Brown. But I do think this is also why Brené Brown's work is so resonant with people in Fortune 100 companies and football teams, because she's speaking to the fact that like we're still people, even in these spaces. And the stuff that we might struggle with are the same kind of things that we need support around, whether that's like on an intimate personal level or on the football field. Apparently, she's very into football and sports from a Texas point of view. Those are her roots. Okay. I'm trying to see like where else I wanted to go because that's an update of the week. That's kind of where I'm at. Those are the things that I'm thinking about. Again, it's related to my own personal life and my own process of what I'm looking at right now. And maybe there's a way that I can weave this in for the sake of vulnerability and just kind of leading into maybe next week. For me, remember, all the ropes, one big knot, working relationships, a container to be able to say personal, professional, political, and philosophical are all related. Yes. For me, of course, this applies. And I am preparing for my final For the Love of Strangers, which is about meaningful connecting with people, on Friday. And I'm not going to spoil anything or give away too much right now, but I've been sitting this week trying to prepare for the finale in a way that's like, how do I make sense of what I've been doing and what I want to continue doing? Since last week, I was also talking about building experimental spaces for people to process and connect and like keep doing this. Well, all of that to me is landing in the space of meta philosophical performance art, which is partly why I started talking about Marina Abramovic and performance art at the very beginning of this. And just like when people don't understand the nature of performance art or art in general, or think that like somehow we're separate from this, if our experiences around like feeling or being human, I don't know. I don't know what people think about art, but I'm really situating myself in the space of calling myself a meta philosophical performance artist. And I know it's a mouthful. My job, I guess, is to try to help people understand what that is and what it looks like. And I'm going to try, maybe, by introducing a little bit of additional context around that on Friday at For the Love of Strangers. I'm not going to go any further into that, except that moving forward, I want to make a little bit of space, mostly just for myself to process and for anybody who is listening, watching, or cares to know, that working relationships, I've now given a little glimpse into what that looks like in terms of like one page. Working relationships is something, I think, its own little fractal, if you will. But it's part of something that I've been thinking about moving forward, which I have named before, but I'll say it again. I kind of am working with the language of like romancing the revolution. And I'm into that. All of this is also operating under a larger umbrella of a philosophical project for me that is developing an epistemology of intimacy. And so if you're on Substack, which anybody who's watching on Substack is, then you're a subscriber to Want to Know. And the way that I even describe Want to Know when I created this newsletter, like, I don't even know. When did I create this? Years ago? A year ago? I use the description of it as being an experimental space to develop an epistemology of intimacy. Maybe this is something to get into next time. Oh gosh, these are my notes from last week. I said I was going to talk about therapy over 2 years. Oh, great, I did that. I was going to unpack definition of love. I did not do that. What does it look like to build in new ways and hold space? Maybe that's what I'm doing right now. Okay, great. Notes from last week. Did not reference them. But moving forward, if I'm leaning very hard into my work, and this is vulnerable because it risks uncertainty, exposure, and the other thing. What was the other thing? Risk, exposure, uncertainty. Oh, yeah, risk. Then I'm spending a lot of time right now, literally right now in this moment of my life, trying to figure out how I can be emotionally secure enough, have boundaries enough to be able to put myself out there enough in a way that can metaphilosophically, performance art way, demonstrate an experiment of how to develop an epistemology of intimacy. And understand that as a project that I will likely title something like Romancing the Revolution, which is kind of the older, evolved version of what began as working relationship in the space of like organizational culture, which I'm not so keen on right now. It's not my favorite place. And that feels super scary, because I need a third year of therapy to be able to move through how to develop an epistemology of intimacy when that actually is putting me front and center to face myself and my stories. And it's raising already so many questions about what it means to know people and how we see ourselves and how we connect with others, the things that we share that are true, and if that actually culminates in some kind of relationship. Trust me, if this is, I've been thinking about this. Back in 2020, I sort of declared that I was going mad. It was when we were all leaving like our work to go quarantine because it was March of 2020 and we thought it was gonna be like 2 or 3 weeks of like isolation. And I was like, well, I'm leaving the office for the last time, taking my plants with me and a laptop. And I like very like flippantly and flamboyantly called over my shoulder to a colleague and was like, this may be how I go mad. And I think it was the first time. Not the first time I had like a breakdown, but madness, yes, a little bit of that happened. I worry and I'm excited that maybe what I'm approaching right now is also like the next season of madness, because the project I'm putting forth for myself is enough to like break a brain, mine especially. So I'm just gonna, yeah, I don't know. I'm being very vague and kind of on purpose because I am right now negotiating like what that looks like in terms of this space, a weekly update. What am I actually sharing? How do I want the work to show itself and then involve other people in a performance art kind of way? The thinking is the doing, is the demonstration, is the showing in a lot of the ways that I want to do this. And if the personal, philosophical, professional, and the political are so interrelated, then like I cannot not have my own personal stakes in the work and the philosophy that I'm sharing with people. That does feel vulnerable. Um, like I said, like in therapy, I'm working on like safety and boundaries. Like those are themes that have always emerged in my life that get, scary when you put yourself out there, because people have a lot of ideas about what kinds of relationships we have with one another. Did I talk about mirrors? Yeah, of course I did. On this page, when I say this is about looking in the mirror, I have a whole other thing operating right now about like how to develop intimacy and relationships with people, when maybe what we're actually doing is just putting all of our projections on others and everybody is a mirror. You know that cliche? Like everybody is just a mirror back to yourself. I don't want us to be solipsistic. That's not the kind of world that I'm looking for. I want us to be seen and see each other. I want us to know one another and feel understood so that we can actually have an authentic, meaningful connection. I do think that's possible. And I also think that so much of the time we exist as mirrors to one another, or even more like insidiously in a mirror world where things get inverted and reflected back in a kind of distortion. I'm referring back to Naomi Klein in that one, if you don't know. I think I maybe have mentioned her before, but it'll come up again. Her book, Doppelganger, where she talks about the mirror world, is like so scary and it's very real and it's what we're in right now. And so this mirroring that happens can also be Really destabilizing in a toxic kind of fascist way. So, lots of things to get into in the year ahead. Um, I don't know where this leaves me right now, but I will say something. I don't know. This is just, I'll end on a personal note, I guess, of kind of like my own little sharing. Actually, last night I wrote a note before I went to sleep. It was like, I'm having a weird relationship with time. I'm not gonna go there. That was a before bed thought. But I'm really having an interesting relationship with time right now, where like, what is time? What is the past? And where's the future? If for no other reason, like here's the example, right? Like the past of finding this from April of 2022, reading it. When I reread my notes from what I wrote in, actually, this is 2021 is when this starts. It's January 11th, 2021. And I said, today was a bad day and I'm proud of how I went through it, but I did a good job. So I wrote about this really terrible good day, like a good bad day that I had. Um, yeah, this is the most self-care rich day I've had in a long time. So it was a really good bad day. That's what made it a good bad day. Anyway, reading back from, I guess now the very beginning of 2021 and then reviewing these notes the other night when I was like reading through it was really, I don't know, it fucks you up if you read your own words and you're like, oh, that's still relevant today, or I'm still feeling that. Or like, am I saying these things again? Still? Yeah, I was actually. I started this whole thing in 2021. This is interesting. This is September of 2021, a last entry. And then I did April of 2022. That must have been the start of working relationships from April of 2022. But I didn't write anything except for some coworkers' names. And that's it. And that's how that went. Next page then, this is where I go December 7th, 2025. So yeah, interesting relationship with time just by this alone. But the other thing that I started doing, which is, I don't know, maybe if you want to practice this or you already do it, I don't know why I'm sharing this. To find myself and try to situate like, what am I doing this week and moving into 2026? The big questions of my life right now. I finished this notebook. Also on, I think last night was the last page. And I went like into the last page, like back cover last page. So as of December 9th, 2025, this notebook is complete. And this one took me pretty much almost exactly 3 months to fill out. So it starts on September 7th, I think, of this year. And when I first read, the very first entry, September 7th, 2025 at 12:10 a.m., I was writing about something very different. It was about like love and relationship. And I only made it this far, which means I'm putting myself into, let's find time, September 22nd. Last night, I got tired when I started reading this pretty late at night. But from September 7th to September 22nd, 2025 this year, I was reviewing what I was writing and then taking notes on just some of the things that I was talking about. And I'm like finding myself again in these pages, like having very clear ideas of what I'm up to. Maybe this is my brain. Maybe this is my madness. Maybe this is my crazy, or maybe I'm just like ruminating in cycles and constantly spinning. But I am seeing in my writing things that I wish I could share, or whether it's directly from the pages or it's something that like this becomes the next project. So I guess right now as an update, I'm going to keep reading this notebook to bring myself up to speed from September into today, December 10th, and see if that gives me some clarity around what I'm up to. But I feel like, I don't know, I kind of want to end on another vulnerability note. Like, I wonder if other people have the experience of finding themselves or seeing themselves again. This is like a weird thing when you're a writer or when you make documentation. Like, I'm very aware right now, like literally, I've said this before in other weeks, like even me making these videos is a form of documentation, which surely will come back to haunt me at some point. Just like me of January 2021 or the whisper of a suggestion from April 2022 or me from September 7th, just a few months ago. Like, there's something interesting about being able to be in relationship with ourselves that maybe, I don't know, maybe are people averse to like documenting themselves or really being honest about their feelings and their thoughts because that feels vulnerable? I'm curious. I'm not sure. I do a lot of documenting and it's a mess. It's like not organized at all. So I'll stumble upon things or I'll find things and be like, wow, how fascinating. I'm rereading old blogs right now from like 2011 too. So interesting. And I'm grateful that I have those records, but I wonder about how other people do it. If you're not a person who documents or writes or journals or does this kind of like practice of reflection of yourself in your own life, like your own personal, shared, private thoughts and feelings, um, I wonder if there's a correlation there about like how vulnerable it feels to really share something with other people because we're not in the practice of like sharing with ourselves or even revisiting and like being curious and reacquainting ourselves with the things of our thoughts and feelings from just like a few months ago or a few years ago. I don't know. Maybe that's a working relationship to work on. I sure should am doing that. Okay, I think that's it. I think I'm gonna end there. This one was kind of wild and weird. Um, Thanks for anybody who is along with the process. I will say that like I anticipate these weekly updates maybe changing a little bit because I am still trying to figure out how to share in the space of developing the epistemology of intimacy and what that looks like. But if you're here, you're here. And if you're in it, you're in it. And something is happening. I think I'm pretty convinced about that. Something is happening. Okay, be well. Take good care. Thank you again. If you want to follow along or get the pages, find those pages in the Substack chat. You can also support in any way with Buy Me a Coffee or just subscribing and sharing my stuff on social media. Okay, take care. Have a good week. See you next time.